The red light of David Morrison's makeshift darkroom cast eerie shadows across the developing trays as he carefully lifted the photograph from the chemical bath. October rain drummed against the basement windows of his Cambridge apartment, creating a rhythm that matched his anxious heartbeat. As a freelance photographer documenting New England's historic architecture, David had developed thousands of images, but something about tonight felt different. The photograph emerged slowly from the developer solution, revealing the sharp details of craftsmanship from nearly a century ago. It showed a bearded carpenter in suspenders and a worn cotton shirt, his weathered hands gripping wooden planks as he framed an attic window. The image had been taken in 1881, according to the estate sale documentation from the Blackwood Victorian mansion in Salem. David had purchased the entire collection of glass plate negatives just 3 days earlier, hoping to find something special for his upcoming exhibition on 19th century New England architecture. As the image became clearer, David leaned closer to examine the intricate details of the window frame. The carpenter's concentration was evident in his focused expression, sweat beading on his forehead, despite what appeared to be a cool autumn day. The mansion's elaborate Victorian trim work was visible in the background, showcasing the ornate style that made these homes architectural treasures. Then, David saw it. Behind the glass of the newly installed attic window, barely visible but unmistakably there, was the pale face of a woman. Her dark hair framed hollow cheeks, and her eyes seemed to stare directly at the camera with an expression of desperate pleading. David's hands trembled as he held the photograph closer to the red light, squinting to make sure his eyes weren't playing tricks on him. The woman's face was translucent, as if she were standing far behind the glass, yet her features were distinct enough to see the anguish etched in her expression. Her mouth appeared to be open, as though she were calling out silently for help. Most disturbing of all, her eyes seemed to follow David as he moved the photograph, creating an optical illusion that made his skin crawl. David set the photograph down on his work table and rubbed his tired eyes. He had been developing images for 6 hours straight, and fatigue could certainly cause hallucinations. But when he looked at the photograph again, the woman's face was still there, clearer than before. Her ethereal presence seemed to grow more defined the longer he stared, as if she were trying to push through the barrier between past and present. The rain outside intensified, and a sudden gust of wind rattled the basement windows. David's overhead light flickered, casting dancing shadows across the photograph. In that moment of shifting illumination, the woman's face seemed to move slightly, her lips appearing to mouth a single word: help. David stumbled backward, knocking over a bottle of stop bath solution. The chemical spilled across the floor, filling the small room with its acrid smell. His heart pounded as he steadied himself against the wall, never taking his eyes off the photograph. The rational part of his mind searched for logical explanations: double exposure, chemical staining, or perhaps damage to the original glass plate negative. But deep in his gut, David knew this was something else entirely. He carefully pinned the photograph to his drying line and began cleaning up the spilled chemicals, all while stealing glances at the image. The woman's face remained visible, her haunting expression unchanged. David had photographed countless historic locations throughout New England, but he had never encountered anything like this. As he finished cleaning, David noticed something else unusual about the photograph. The carpenter in the image wore an expression of subtle unease, as though he sensed something was wrong. His eyes occasionally glanced toward the window he was framing, and there was tension in his shoulders that suggested more than just physical exertion from his work. David retrieved the original glass plate negative from its protective sleeve and held it up to the light. The woman's face was there too, embedded in the emulsion like a ghostly watermark. This wasn't a developing error or chemical contamination. Whatever had been captured in 1881 was permanently etched into the photographic medium. The wind outside grew stronger, and the old Victorian house above David's basement apartment creaked and groaned in response. The sounds reminded him uncomfortably of the mansion in the photograph, and he wondered if all old houses carried the weight of their histories in their wooden bones. David looked at his watch. 11:47 p.m. Tomorrow he would begin researching the Blackwood mansion and the people who had lived there. He needed to understand what had happened in that attic nearly a century ago and why this woman's face had been captured in what should have been a simple documentation of carpentry work. As he prepared to leave his darkroom, David took one final look at the photograph. The woman's eyes seemed to bore into his soul, and for just a moment, he could have sworn he heard the faint sound of weeping coming from somewhere deep within the old house above. The Salem Historical Society occupied a brick federal-style building on Chestnut Street, its windows overlooking the town common where accused witches had once faced their accusers. David arrived early Tuesday morning, the mysterious photograph carefully protected in a manila envelope tucked under his arm. The October air carried the scent of burning leaves and the promise of an early winter. Eleanor Whitmore, the Society's head librarian, was a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and wire-rimmed spectacles that made her pale blue eyes appear larger than they were. She had worked at the Historical Society for over 30 years and knew the dark corners of Salem's past better than anyone. "The Blackwood Mansion," Eleanor repeated thoughtfully as she led David through rows of filing cabinets toward the research room. "Now that's a name I haven't heard in quite some time. Most people avoid talking about that place." David followed her into a small room lined with leather-bound volumes and wooden filing cabinets. Dust motes danced in the morning sunlight that streamed through tall windows. "Why do people avoid it?" Eleanor pulled out several thick folders and set them on the oak table. The Blackwoods were one of Salem's prominent families in the late 1800s. Edmund Blackwood made his fortune in shipping and built that Victorian monstrosity in 1880. But the family was plagued by tragedy from the moment they moved in. She opened the first folder, revealing newspaper clippings yellowed with age. Edmund's wife, Catherine, died in childbirth in 1881, just a year after they completed the house. Their daughter Margaret was born healthy, but Catherine never recovered from the complications. David leaned forward, studying a daguerreotype of the Blackwood family. Edmund appeared stern and unforgiving, with deep-set eyes and a heavy beard. Catherine looked frail even in the photograph, her thin frame almost lost in her elaborate Victorian dress. Between them stood young Margaret, perhaps 16 years old, with dark hair and delicate features that reminded David uncomfortably of the face in his photograph. "What happened to Margaret?" David asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Eleanor's expression grew somber. "That's where the story gets strange. Margaret disappeared in October of 1881, during the final construction phase of the house. They were adding some finishing touches to the attic space when she simply vanished." She pulled out another newspaper clipping, dated October 15, 1881. The headline read, "Blackwood Daughter Missing. Search Continues for Prominent Family's Only Child." "The police searched for weeks," Eleanor continued. "They interviewed all the construction workers, searched the surrounding woods, even dragged the harbor. Margaret had simply disappeared without a trace, as if she had never existed." David felt a chill run down his spine. Were there any suspects? The last person to see her alive was Thomas Hartwell, the carpenter who was working on the attic windows. He claimed Margaret had come up to inspect the work around noon, and that was the last anyone saw of her. Hartwell left town shortly after she disappeared, which naturally made him the prime suspect. Eleanor opened another folder containing architectural drawings of the Blackwood Mansion. The detailed blueprints showed the elaborate Victorian structure, with its numerous rooms, hidden passages, and complex roofline. David's eyes were immediately drawn to the third-floor attic space. "These are the original construction plans," Eleanor explained. "You can see how complex the house was. Multiple additions, false walls, servant passages. The police believed Margaret might have gotten trapped somewhere in the construction, but they never found any evidence." David studied the drawings carefully, noting the location of the attic window where the mysterious photograph had been taken. "Did anyone ever see Thomas Hartwell again?" "Never. He left Salem the day after Margaret disappeared and was never heard from again. Some people believed he killed her and fled. Others thought he might have been involved in some kind of accident and panicked." Eleanor paused, looking directly at David. "But you didn't come here just for a history lesson, did you? What's your real interest in the Blackwood Mansion?" David hesitated, then pulled the photograph from his envelope. "I developed this from a glass plate negative I bought at an estate sale. It shows a carpenter working on an attic window in 1881, but look closely at the window itself." Eleanor put on her reading glasses and examined the photograph under the table lamp. Her face went pale, and she set the image down quickly as if it had burned her fingers. "Dear God," she whispered, "that's Margaret Blackwood. I'd recognize her face anywhere from the family portraits we have in our collection. But how is that possible? If this photograph was taken during construction in 1881, and Margaret disappeared in October of that year, the timing would be exactly right," Eleanor finished. "This could be the last photograph ever taken of her." She looked at the image again, her hands trembling slightly. "But David, this is impossible. Margaret was supposed to be downstairs when this photograph was taken, and look at her face. She appears to be behind the glass, but the window had just been installed. How could she be on the other side? David leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of the mystery settling around him like a shroud. "I was hoping you might have some answers." Eleanor stood up abruptly and walked to the window, gazing out at the Salem common. "There have been rumors about that house for decades. People claim to see lights in the windows at night, even though it's been abandoned for years. Some say they've heard crying coming from the attic." She turned back to David, her expression troubled. "I think you may have stumbled onto something that was meant to stay buried. And if the stories about that house are true, Margaret Blackwood may still be trying to tell someone what really happened to her." The room suddenly felt colder, and David noticed that the photograph on the table seemed to shimmer slightly in the changing light. Margaret's eyes appeared more desperate than before, as if she knew someone was finally listening to her silent plea for help. The Blackwood mansion stood at the end of Gallows Hill Road, like a Gothic monument to forgotten tragedies. David parked his rusted Volkswagen van beneath the skeletal branches of an ancient oak tree and stared up at the three-story Victorian structure. Even in the pale afternoon sunlight, the house seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, its dark wooden shingles and ornate trim work creating deep shadows that shifted ominously in the October breeze. Weeds had claimed the front yard decades ago, and the wraparound porch sagged under the weight of neglect. Several windows on the first floor were boarded up with weathered plywood, but the upper floors still had their original glass intact. David's eyes immediately found the attic window from his photograph, positioned at the peak of the house's elaborate roofline. Eleanor had given him the key reluctantly, along with a stern warning about the house's unstable condition. The Salem Historical Society had inherited the property in 1962, when the last surviving Blackwood heir died without children, but they had never had the funds to properly restore or maintain the structure. It had been sitting empty for over a decade, slowly surrendering to the elements. David grabbed his camera bag and flashlight from the van, then approached the front door. The key turned easily in the old lock, as if the house were eager to welcome him inside. The heavy wooden door swung open with a prolonged creak that echoed through the empty rooms beyond. The interior was a time capsule of Victorian excess. Ornate wallpaper, though faded and peeling, still displayed intricate patterns of roses and vines. A grand staircase dominated the entry hall, its carved banister disappearing into the shadows of the upper floors. Dust particles danced in the shafts of sunlight that managed to penetrate the grimy windows. David's footsteps echoed hollowly on the hardwood floors as he moved through the first floor rooms. The parlor still contained some original furniture, covered in dusty white sheets, creating ghostly shapes in the dim light. In the dining room, a massive table sat beneath a crystal chandelier that had lost half its prisms to time and gravity. As he explored, David began taking photographs, documenting the mansion's current state. Through his camera viewfinder, the house took on an even more sinister appearance. Shadows seemed deeper, and every corner held the potential for hidden secrets. He found himself checking over his shoulder frequently, though he knew he was alone in the house. The kitchen revealed evidence of the mansion's abandonment. Rusted pots still sat on the old cast-iron stove, and newspapers from 1962 lay scattered on the countertops. Our calendar on the wall was turned to October of that year, the same month Margaret had disappeared 81 years earlier. David climbed the main staircase to the second floor, each step producing a symphony of creaks and groans from the aged wood. The upstairs hallway was lined with family portraits, their subjects staring down at him with expressions ranging from stern disapproval to melancholy resignation. He recognized Edmund and Catherine Blackwood from the photographs Eleanor had shown him, but it was Margaret's portrait that made him stop in his tracks. The painting showed her at perhaps 18 years old, wearing a deep blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes. Her dark hair was arranged in the fashionable style of the 1880s, and her expression held a hint of sadness that seemed prophetic given her fate. Most disturbing of all, her painted eyes seemed to follow David as he moved down the hallway, just as they had in the photograph. The master bedroom still contained the Blackwoods' original furniture, a massive four-poster bed, an ornate armoire, and a vanity table with a cracked mirror. David noticed that someone had left flowers on the vanity recently, fresh roses that couldn't have been there for more than a day or two. The discovery sent a chill down his spine. Who else had been in this abandoned house? As he photographed the second floor, David became increasingly aware of the sounds the old house made. Wood settling, wind whistling through gaps in the window frames, and something else, a subtle creaking from above that suggested movement in the attic. He told himself it was just the house responding to temperature changes, but the sound had an almost rhythmic quality, like footsteps pacing back and forth. The narrow staircase to the third floor was steeper and more precarious than the main stairs. David climbed carefully, testing each step before putting his full weight on it. The attic space was larger than he had expected, running nearly the full length of the house, with dormer windows providing natural light. As he reached the top of the stairs, David found himself facing the exact spot where the 1881 photograph had been taken. The window frame was still there, though the glass was now cracked and dirty. The wooden beams showed the craftsmanship of Thomas Hartwell, their joints still tight after nearly a century. David set up his camera and took several shots of the window, trying to recreate the angle of the original photograph. Through his viewfinder, he could imagine Thomas Hartwell working here, unaware that he was being photographed or that something supernatural was occurring just feet away from him. As David lowered his camera, a sudden gust of wind rattled the attic windows. In the moments that followed, he heard something that made his blood run cold, the faint sound of a woman weeping, so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind. But the crying had a distinctly human quality, filled with despair and longing. David stood perfectly still, straining to locate the source of the sound. It seemed to come from within the walls themselves, as if someone were trapped in the space between the inner and outer surfaces. The crying continued for nearly a minute before fading away, leaving only the normal sounds of the old house settling around him. He examined the walls carefully, looking for any signs of hidden passages or concealed spaces. The attic construction was complex, with multiple support beams and what appeared to be several false walls designed to accommodate the house's elaborate roofline. As David ran his hands along the wooden panels, he discovered that one section sounded hollow when tapped. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Margaret Blackwood might actually be here, sealed within the walls of her family's home for 93 years. And if the mysterious photograph was any indication, her spirit was still very much present, still trying to communicate with the world of the living. David returned to the Blackwood mansion the following morning with a toolbox borrowed from his landlord and a growing sense of urgency that he couldn't explain. The October sky was overcast, casting the Victorian house in shades of grey that made it appear even more foreboding than it had the day before. As he approached the front door, David noticed that the fresh roses he had seen on the vanity table were now scattered on the front porch, their petals brown and withered as if they had aged decades overnight. Inside the house, the atmosphere felt different. The air was thicker, more oppressive, and David found himself breathing heavily as he climbed the stairs to the attic. Every shadow seemed to move independently of its source, and the floorboards creaked beneath his feet with what sounded almost like whispered warnings. In the attic, David immediately went to the section of wall that had sounded hollow. In the morning light filtering through the dirty windows, he could see subtle variations in the wood grain that suggested this panel had been installed separately from the rest of the wall. The craftsmanship was skilled but hurried, as if someone had needed to complete the work quickly. David began carefully prying at the edges of the panel with a crowbar, trying not to damage the historic woodwork unnecessarily. As he worked, he found himself thinking about Thomas Hartwell, the carpenter who had disappeared so mysteriously. Had Hartwell been responsible for sealing this wall? And if so, had he known what he was concealing? After 20 minutes of careful work, the wooden panel began to give way. David could feel cool air seeping through the growing gap, carrying with it a musty smell that spoke of decades of confinement. As he pried the panel further from the wall, the crying sound he had heard the day before returned, louder and more distinct. It was definitely the sound of a woman weeping, and it was coming from directly behind the wall. With a final pull, the wooden panel came free, revealing a narrow space between the inner and outer walls of the house. David's flashlight beam penetrated the darkness, and what he saw there made him stagger backward in shock. Huddled in the corner of the confined space were the skeletal remains of a young woman, still wearing the tattered remnants of a blue Victorian dress. Her dark hair, though dulled by time, was still partially intact, and around her neck was a delicate silver locket. Even after nearly a century, there was no mistaking the identity of these remains. Margaret Blackwood had been found at last. But the discovery raised more questions than it answered. How had Margaret ended up in this wall? The space was barely large enough for a person to fit, and there was no obvious way she could have entered voluntarily. The wooden panel had been nailed shut from the outside, with no means of escape from within. As David examined the scene more closely, His flashlight revealed something even more disturbing. Scratch marks covered the inner walls, as if Margaret had clawed desperately at the wooden surfaces trying to escape. Some of her fingernails were still embedded in the wood, testifying to her final moments of terror and desperation. The weeping sound grew louder, and David realized with growing horror that it wasn't coming from the skeletal remains. The sound was emanating from somewhere else in the attic, as if Margaret's spirit was separate from her physical remains. He followed the sound across the room, his flashlight beam dancing across the dusty floorboards. Near the attic window where the original photograph had been taken, David discovered something that made his hands tremble. Carved into the wooden window frame so faintly that it was barely visible were the words "Help me," scratched in what appeared to be a woman's handwriting. Below the plea, someone had carved the initials MB and the date OCT 13, 1881. David compared the carving to his photograph of the window under construction. In the 1881 image, those markings weren't visible, which meant Margaret had carved them after Thomas Hartwell had finished his work, but before she died. She had been alive in this attic, trying to communicate her desperate situation to anyone who might find her. As David photographed the carved message, he heard footsteps on the stairs below. Heavy, deliberate steps that couldn't be explained by the house settling or the wind. Someone else was in the mansion, climbing steadily toward the attic. David's heart raced as he realized he was trapped in the uppermost floor of the house with no alternative exit. The footsteps reached the attic stairs and began the final ascent. David turned off his flashlight and crouched behind one of the support beams, trying to make himself invisible in the shadows. Through the gaps in the floorboards, he could see a dark figure moving up the narrow staircase, backlit by the dim light from below. As the intruder reached the attic, David caught a glimpse of an elderly man in a worn coat and hat. The stranger moved with surprising confidence for someone navigating the cluttered attic space, as if he had been here many times before. In the pale light from the windows, David could see that the man was carrying flowers, fresh roses identical to the ones David had found scattered on the porch. The elderly visitor approached Margaret's remains with reverence, kneeling beside the opening in the wall. He placed the roses gently near the skeletal remains and began speaking in a whispered voice that David could barely hear. "I'm sorry, Margaret. I'm so very sorry. I never meant for it to happen this way. I tried to come back for you, but it was too late. I've been bringing you flowers for 40 years trying to make amends." David realized with shock that he was listening to a confession. This elderly man knew something about Margaret's death, and he had been visiting her remains in secret for decades. As the visitor continued his whispered apology, David carefully reached for his camera, determined to document this extraordinary encounter. The camera's shutter clicked once in the silence of the attic, and the elderly man spun around with surprising speed. In the dim light, David found himself staring into the weathered face of a man who had to be at least 90 years old, with pale blue eyes that held decades of guilt and sorrow. "Who's there?" the old man called out, his voice trembling with both fear and anger. "Show yourself." David realized he had no choice but to reveal himself. He stood up slowly, his hands raised to show he meant no harm. "I'm David Morrison. I'm a photographer researching the history of this house." The elderly man stared at David for a long moment, his expression cycling through surprise, fear, and finally resignation. "Then I suppose it's time someone knew the truth about what happened to Margaret Blackwood. My name is Thomas Hartwell, Jr., and my father was the man who sealed her in this wall." Thomas Hartwell, Jr. lowered himself onto an old wooden crate with the careful movements of a man whose bones had carried the weight of a terrible secret for too many years. In the dim attic light, David could see that he was probably in his early 90s, with white hair and deeply lined features that spoke of a lifetime of guilt and regret. "I've been waiting for this day for 40 years, Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Ever since I found my father's journal and learned what really happened up here in 1881. David sat down across from him, his camera resting in his lap. The presence of Margaret's remains seemed to fill the attic with an expectant silence, as if her spirit was finally ready to hear the truth spoken aloud. "My father never spoke about his time working on this house," Thomas continued. "He left Salem the day after Margaret disappeared and took our family to Maine, where he worked as a carpenter until he died in 1923. It wasn't until I was cleaning out his belongings that I found his private journal hidden in the bottom of an old trunk." Thomas reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a leather-bound book, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. "Everything is written here, in his own handwriting. The whole terrible story of what happened on October 13th, 1881. He opened the journal carefully, his fingers tracing the faded ink as he found the relevant passage. My father was working alone up here that day, finishing the window frame you see over there. Margaret came up to inspect the progress, as she often did during construction. She was fascinated by the building process and liked to watch the craftsmen work. David glanced toward the window, where he had found Margaret's carved plea for help. In the pale afternoon light, the scratched words seemed to stand out more prominently, as if her desperation was becoming stronger. According to the journal, Margaret was standing near that window when she suddenly became dizzy and collapsed. My father rushed to help her, but she was unconscious and barely breathing. He realized she was having some kind of medical crisis, possibly related to a condition she had inherited from her mother. Thomas's voice grew more strained as he continued. My father ran downstairs to get help, but when he returned with Edmund Blackwood and the house servants, they found Margaret had stopped breathing. She was dead. David felt a chill run through him. But why didn't they call for a doctor? Why hide her death? You have to understand the situation, Thomas replied, closing the journal momentarily. Edmund Blackwood was already devastated by his wife's death earlier that year. He was convinced that the house was cursed, that it was somehow responsible for taking both his wife and now his daughter, and there was something else. Thomas opened the journal again, finding another passage. My father wrote that Edmund discovered Margaret was with child. An unmarried pregnancy in 1881 would have been a devastating scandal for a prominent family like the Blackwoods. Edmund couldn't bear the thought of the scandal becoming public, even after her death. The implications of this revelation hit David like a physical blow. So Edmund decided to hide her death entirely? Exactly. He ordered my father to seal Margaret's body in the wall and tell everyone she had simply disappeared. In exchange, Edmund would pay my father enough money to start a new life far away from Salem. The official story would be that Margaret had run away, perhaps eloped with some young man. It would be embarrassing, but not as destructive as the truth. Thomas stood up slowly and approached Margaret's remains, his eyes filled with tears. But my father couldn't live with what he had done. The journal entries from the weeks that followed show a man tormented by guilt and regret. He wrote that he could hear Margaret calling for help in his dreams, begging him to set her free. What do you mean, calling for help? David asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. My father believed Margaret wasn't completely dead when they sealed her in the wall. The journal describes how he heard scratching sounds and muffled cries coming from behind the panel for several days after the construction was finished. He was convinced she had awakened in that confined space and died slowly, calling out for someone to rescue her. David's stomach turned as he looked at the scratch marks on the inner walls of Margaret's prison. The evidence supported Thomas's story. Margaret had indeed been alive when the wall was sealed, trapped in darkness and slowly suffocating as her air supply dwindled. My father wrote his final entry on October 20th, 1881, exactly 1 week after Margaret's disappearance. He said he couldn't stand the guilt any longer and was leaving Salem forever, but he made a promise in that final entry. If he was ever able to return, he would free Margaret from her prison and give her a proper burial. Thomas wiped tears from his weathered cheeks. My father never came back to Salem. He died in Maine, still carrying the weight of what he had done. So in 1934, when I was old enough and had saved enough money, I made the journey here to fulfill his promise. You've been visiting her for 40 years, David asked. Every October 13th, on the anniversary of her death, I bring flowers and apologize on behalf of my father. I've tried several times to remove the panel and free her remains, but I'm too old now and the work is beyond my capabilities. I had hoped that someday someone else would discover the truth and give Margaret the justice she deserves. As Thomas finished his confession, the temperature in the attic seemed to drop noticeably. Both men could see their breath in the suddenly frigid air, and the crying sound that David had heard before returned, louder and more urgent than ever. The sound seemed to come from directly above them, as if Margaret's spirit was hovering in the rafters, finally able to communicate her story. The weeping continued for several minutes, filled with a mixture of sorrow and what David could only interpret as relief. After decades of silence, Margaret's story was finally being told. But as the crying faded away, David realized that knowing the truth was only the beginning. Margaret Blackwood deserved more than just flowers and apologies. She deserved justice, a proper burial, and perhaps most importantly, she deserved to have her story told to the world. As David looked at the elderly Thomas Hartwell Jr., he understood that he had become part of something much larger than a simple historical mystery. He was now responsible for ensuring that Margaret's tragic story would never be forgotten again. David helped Thomas down the narrow attic stairs, the elderly man's confession having drained him of what little strength remained in his 90-year-old frame. As they reached the second floor, David noticed that several of the family portraits had been disturbed during their time in the attic. Margaret's painting now hung crooked on the wall, and her painted eyes seemed to follow them with renewed intensity. "She knows," Thomas whispered, pausing to straighten his daughter's portrait with trembling hands. "Margaret knows that her story is finally going to be told." They made their way to the first floor parlor, where David helped Thomas settle into one of the sheet-covered chairs. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the grimy windows, and the house seemed to creak and settle around them with unusual frequency, as if the building itself was responding to the revelation of its dark secret. "What happens now?" Thomas asked, his voice barely audible in the dusty silence of the room. "We contact the authorities," David replied. "The police, the medical examiner, someone who can properly investigate Margaret's remains and give her the burial she deserves." Thomas nodded slowly, but his expression was troubled. "There's something else you need to know, something I didn't mention upstairs. My father's journal contained a warning, something about the consequences of disturbing Margaret's resting place." David felt a familiar chill run down his spine. "What kind of warning?" Thomas reached into his coat and withdrew the journal again, flipping to one of the final entries. "My father wrote that in the days after Margaret was sealed in the wall, strange things began happening throughout the house. Lights would flicker on and off, doors would slam shut on their own, and the temperature would drop suddenly in certain rooms." "Poltergeist activity," David murmured, remembering the similar phenomena he had experienced during his visits to the mansion. "But it got worse," Thomas continued. "Edmund Blackwood began seeing Margaret's ghost throughout the house. She would appear in mirrors, standing behind him with an expression of accusation and rage. She would whisper his name in empty rooms, and sometimes he would wake to find her standing at the foot of his bed, pointing an accusing finger at him." Thomas turned the page, his hands shaking as he read his father's increasingly frantic handwriting. "Edmund became convinced that Margaret's spirit would never rest until her death was avenged. Within 6 months, his health began to deteriorate rapidly. He developed a persistent cough that no doctor could cure, and he began losing weight at an alarming rate." "How did Edmund die?" David asked, though he suspected the answer would not be pleasant. "He was found dead in his study in March of 1882, just 5 months after Margaret's disappearance. The official cause of death was listed as pneumonia, but my father wrote that Edmund's final days were tormented by visions of his daughter. He would scream her name in his sleep and beg for her forgiveness." As Thomas spoke, the parlor grew noticeably colder, and David could hear what sounded like footsteps moving through the rooms above them. The footsteps had a distinctly feminine quality, light and quick, as if someone in long skirts was pacing back and forth across the second floor. "My father believed that Margaret's spirit was responsible for Edmund's death," Thomas continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, "and he feared that anyone who knew the truth about her murder would suffer the same fate." The footsteps above grew louder and more insistent, accompanied by the sound of doors opening and closing throughout the house. David could hear what sounded like furniture being moved, as if someone were searching frantically through the upper rooms. "She's becoming more active," Thomas observed, looking up at the ceiling with a mixture of fear and sadness. "Telling her story has awakened something in her spirit. My father wrote that Margaret's ghost grows stronger whenever someone learns the truth about her death." Suddenly, the crystal chandelier above them began to sway violently, its remaining prisms chiming together like ghostly wind chimes. The temperature in the room dropped so rapidly that both men could see their breath, and frost began forming on the inside of the windows despite the mild October weather outside. Then David heard it. Margaret's voice, clear and distinct, calling out from somewhere in the house above them. "David," the voice called, sweet and pleading. "David, please help me." Thomas grabbed David's arm with surprising strength. "Don't go to her," he warned urgently. "My father wrote about this. She'll try to draw you deeper into the house, deeper into her world. Some spirits become possessive of those who show them kindness." But the voice called again, more insistent this time. "David, I need you to understand. There's more to the story. Come to me." Despite Thomas's warning, David found himself standing up, drawn by an irresistible compulsion to follow Margaret's voice. The elderly man tried to hold him back, but David's legs seemed to move of their own accord, carrying him toward the main staircase. "She's not just asking for help anymore," Thomas called after him desperately. "She's demanding it. My father wrote that Margaret's spirit becomes angry when people learn her story, but don't act quickly enough to give her justice." David paused at the bottom of the stairs, his hand on the carved banister. Above him, Margaret's voice continued to call his name, but now there was an edge of impatience in her tone that hadn't been there before. The footsteps on the second floor had stopped, as if she were waiting for him to join her. "What did your father write about people who tried to help her?" David asked, turning back to Thomas. The elderly man's face was pale with fear. "He wrote about a servant who tried to investigate Margaret's disappearance in 1882. The man claimed to hear her voice calling for help, just as you're hearing now. He became obsessed with finding her, spending hours searching the house and talking to her spirit." "What happened to him?" Thomas's voice was barely a whisper. "They found him dead in the attic 3 weeks later. He had apparently tried to tear down every wall in the house looking for Margaret's body. The authorities said he died of exhaustion and exposure, but my father believed Margaret's spirit had driven him mad, with her constant demands for justice." As if responding to Thomas's words, Margaret's voice called out again, but this time there was unmistakable anger in her tone. "David, you cannot ignore me. I have waited too long." The chandelier began swaying more violently, and several of the remaining prisms crashed to the floor, shattering into brilliant fragments. Throughout the house, doors began slamming with increasing frequency, creating a thunderous cacophony that seemed to shake the very foundations of the Victorian mansion. David realized that discovering Margaret's story had awakened something far more dangerous than a simple restless spirit. He had unleashed the fury of a woman who had been denied justice for nearly a century, and now she expected him to make things right. The question was whether he could help her find peace before her anger consumed him entirely. David returned to his Cambridge apartment that evening with Thomas Hartwell Jr.'s journal clutched in his trembling hands. The elderly man had insisted David take it, claiming that Margaret's spirit had chosen him to be her advocate. As darkness fell over the city, David found himself unable to concentrate on anything other than the haunting voice that had called his name in the Blackwood mansion. He spread the contents of his research across his kitchen table, the original photograph, copies of newspaper clippings from the Salem Historical Society, architectural drawings of the mansion, and Thomas's father's journal. Under the harsh, fluorescent light of his apartment, the evidence of Margaret's tragic fate seemed even more compelling and disturbing. David opened the journal to Thomas Hartwell Sr. His final entries, reading by lamplight the increasingly frantic handwriting of a man tormented by guilt. The carpenter's words painted a picture of supernatural activity that had begun immediately after Margaret was sealed in the attic wall. October 14th, 1881. I can hear her calling from within the wall. "Dear God, what have we done?" Edmund insists she was already dead, but the sounds from behind the panel suggest otherwise. I cannot sleep for the scratching and the crying. October 16th, 1881. The manifestations are growing stronger. Margaret appeared to me in a mirror today, her face pale and accusing. She mouthed the word murderer before vanishing. Edmund has forbidden anyone from going to the attic, but I can still hear her calling for help. October 18th, 1881. I found scratch marks on the inside of my bedroom door this morning, as if someone had been trying to claw their way out. The marks match the size and pattern of a woman's fingernails. Margaret is not confined to the mansion. She is following me. As David read these entries, his apartment grew noticeably colder. The heating system hadn't yet been turned on for the winter, but the temperature drop was far more dramatic than could be explained by the October weather. His breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air, and he could hear what sounded like footsteps pacing back and forth in the apartment above his. David looked up at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic footsteps. His upstairs neighbor was an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen, who rarely left her apartment and certainly never paced around at this hour of the night. The footsteps had the same light, quick quality he had heard at the Blackwood mansion, as if someone in long Victorian skirts was walking across the floor. He returned to the journal, but the words seemed to blur together as the temperature in the room continued to drop. The fluorescent light above the kitchen table began to flicker sporadically, casting dancing shadows across the pages of Thomas's father's confession. October 20th, 1881. I can bear this no longer. Margaret came to me in a dream last night, but she was no longer the gentle girl I had known. Her face was twisted with rage, and her eyes held a terrible accusation. She told me that I had condemned her to an eternity of suffering, trapped between life and death. I must leave Salem before her vengeance destroys me entirely. As David finished reading this final entry, the footsteps above him stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was more unsettling than the noise had been, pregnant with expectation and menace. Then, slowly, David began to hear a new sound, the soft crying that had become so familiar to him at the mansion. The weeping seemed to come from within the walls of his own apartment, as if Margaret's spirit had followed him home. The sound grew louder and more distinct, filled with the same desperate sorrow he had heard in the attic of the Blackwood house. David stood up from the kitchen table and walked to the living room window, looking out at the quiet Cambridge street below. The neighborhood was peaceful, with only a few lit windows visible in the surrounding buildings. But as he watched, David noticed something that made his blood run cold. Standing beneath a streetlight across from his building was the unmistakable figure of a young woman in Victorian dress. Her dark hair fell around her shoulders, and her pale face was turned up toward David's apartment window. Even from 3 floors up, he could see that her eyes were fixed directly on him. David blinked hard and looked again, certain that his tired mind was playing tricks on him. But the figure remained, motionless and watching. As he stared down at her, the woman raised one arm and pointed directly at David's window, her mouth moving as if she were calling his name. The crying inside David's apartment grew louder, now accompanied by what sounded like scratching coming from within the walls. David pressed his ear to the wall and could distinctly hear the sound of fingernails clawing at wood, desperate and frantic. When he looked out the window again, the Victorian woman was gone. But now David could hear her voice clearly, as if she were standing right beside him in the room. "David," Margaret's voice whispered, sweet but insistent. "You know the truth now. You cannot pretend you don't know what happened to me." David spun around, expecting to see her standing in his living room, but he was alone. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, surrounding him like an accusation. "I have waited so long for someone to understand," the voice continued. "Thomas Hartwell sealed me in that wall while I was still alive. I scratched at those wooden panels until my fingernails broke and bled, calling for help that never came." The scratching sounds in David's walls grew more violent, as if Margaret's spirit was reliving her final desperate moments. David could imagine her trapped in that narrow space, slowly suffocating as her air supply dwindled, clawing helplessly at the walls that imprisoned her. "Edmund Blackwood ordered my death to protect his family's reputation." Margaret's voice grew stronger, filled with righteous anger. "He cared more about scandal than he did about his own daughter's life. They both must be punished for what they did to me." "But they're already dead," David said aloud, feeling foolish for speaking to empty air but unable to stop himself. "Edmund died in 1882, and Thomas Hartwell died in 1923. They've been gone for decades." "Death is not punishment enough," Margaret replied, her voice now carrying a chilling edge. "They escape justice in life, but I will have my revenge in death, and you, David, will help me achieve it." The temperature in David's apartment dropped even further, and frost began forming on the windows. The scratching in the walls became so loud that David was certain his neighbors would complain, but somehow he knew that only he could hear Margaret's supernatural manifestation. "What do you want from me?" David asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I want the world to know what they did to me," Margaret replied. "I want their crimes exposed so that everyone will know the truth about my death. But more than that, I want them to suffer, as I have suffered." "How can they suffer? They're dead." Margaret's laughter filled the apartment, cold and bitter. "Death is not the end, David. It is only the beginning. Edmund Blackwood and Thomas Hartwell are trapped in their own prison now, just as I was trapped in mine. But I can reach them, and I will make them pay for what they did to me." As Margaret spoke, David began to understand the true horror of his situation. He wasn't just dealing with a restless spirit seeking justice. He was dealing with a vengeful ghost who had spent nearly a century planning her revenge. And somehow David had become an essential part of her plan for supernatural retribution. David barely slept that night, tormented by dreams in which Margaret Blackwood appeared at his bedside, her pale face twisted with rage and accusation. When he finally gave up trying to rest, it was 4 in the morning and the scratching sounds in his walls had not stopped. He made coffee with shaking hands and tried to think rationally about his situation. By dawn, David had made his decision. He would contact Detective Ray Sullivan of the Salem Police Department, a man Eleanor Whitmore had mentioned as being sympathetic to historical investigations. If Margaret wanted justice, the proper authorities needed to be involved, regardless of the supernatural circumstances surrounding the case. Detective Sullivan met David at the Blackwood mansion later that morning, bringing with him a crime scene photographer and the county medical examiner. Sullivan was a man in his 50s with greying hair and skeptical eyes that had seen too many strange cases over his 20-year career in Salem. "So you're telling me you found human remains in the wall based on a ghost story and a photograph from 1881? Sullivan asked as they stood in the mansion's front hall. "I know how it sounds," David replied, leading the detective and his team up the stairs. "But the evidence is all here. The remains, the historical documentation, even a confession from the carpenter's son." In the attic, Detective Sullivan's skepticism evaporated as soon as he saw Margaret's skeletal remains still positioned in the narrow wall space. The medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Hayes, immediately began her preliminary examination while the crime scene photographer documented everything. "The positioning of the remains suggests confinement," Dr. Hayes observed, carefully examining Margaret's bones. "And these scratch marks on the walls indicate she was alive when she was placed here. This appears to be a case of murder by imprisonment." Detective Sullivan studied Thomas Hartwell Sr.'s journal while Dr. Hayes continued her work. "This Carpenter's confession is detailed enough to be credible, and the timeline matches with the historical records of Margaret Blackwood's disappearance." As the official investigation proceeded, David found himself watching the attic window where Margaret's spirit had first appeared to him. The morning sunlight streaming through the dirty glass created patterns on the floor that seemed to shift and move independently, as if Margaret's presence was still very much active in the room. "There's something else you need to see," David said, directing Detective Sullivan's attention to the window frame. "Margaret carved a message here before she died." Sullivan examined the faint scratches in the wood, reading the desperate plea that had been hidden for nearly a century. "Help me, MB. October 13th, 1881. This confirms the timeline in the journal. She was alive in here for at least a day after she was sealed in the wall." Dr. Hayes made another disturbing discovery as she examined Margaret's remains more closely. "Detective, you need to see this. The victim appears to have been pregnant at the time of death. I can see evidence of fetal remains, probably about 4 months along." The revelation added another layer of tragedy to Margaret's story. She had died not only as a victim of her father's obsession with family reputation, but as a mother whose unborn child had been sacrificed to preserve social standing. As the investigation continued, David noticed that the temperature in the attic was beginning to drop, just as it had during his previous encounters with Margaret's spirit. The other men seemed oblivious to the supernatural activity, but David could feel Margaret's presence growing stronger with each new discovery. Detective Sullivan was photographing the journal entries when he suddenly looked up with a puzzled expression. "Did someone just call my name?" David felt his heart race as he realized that Margaret's spirit was no longer confining her manifestations to him alone. "What did you hear?" "It sounded like a woman's voice, very faint, probably just the wind in the old house." Sullivan returned to his work, but David could see that the detective was now more alert to his surroundings. "Doctor." Hayes completed her preliminary examination and began carefully removing Margaret's remains for transport to the medical examiner's office. As she lifted the skeletal remains, David heard Margaret's voice clearly for the first time since the previous night. "Thank you," the voice whispered, filled with gratitude and relief. "Finally, someone believes me." But as Dr. Hayes carried the remains toward the attic stairs, Margaret's voice returned with a different tone entirely. "Now they will pay for what they did to me. Edmund and Thomas will face justice at last." David realized with growing alarm that Margaret's idea of justice might be far more terrible than simple legal vindication. Her spirit had been feeding on anger and thoughts of revenge for nearly a century, and now that her story was being officially acknowledged, she might feel empowered to act on those dark impulses. As the official team prepared to leave the mansion with Margaret's remains, Detective Sullivan turned to David with a serious expression. "This is going to be a complicated case to prosecute, considering that all the suspects have been dead for decades. But we'll do everything we can to ensure Margaret Blackwood gets the justice she deserves." David nodded, but privately he wondered if official justice would be enough to satisfy Margaret's vengeful spirit. As they left the attic, he could feel her presence following them, no longer the desperate pleading ghost who had first called for help. Now Margaret Blackwood was something far more dangerous, a spirit who had tasted vindication and wanted more. That evening, David received a phone call from Thomas Hartwell Jr. The elderly man's voice was shaking with fear as he described the supernatural activity that had begun occurring in his main home. "She's here," Thomas whispered into the phone. "Margaret is here, and she's angry. She keeps saying that finding her body was just the beginning. She wants something more from us, David. Something terrible. As David listened to Thomas's frightened words, he understood that uncovering Margaret's story had been the easy part. Now he would have to find a way to appease the vengeful spirit of a woman who had spent nearly a century planning her supernatural revenge. And he was beginning to suspect that Margaret's definition of justice might require a price that no living person should have to pay. David's exhibition opening at the Cambridge Gallery of Historical Photography was supposed to be the crowning achievement of his career. He had spent weeks preparing the display, centering it around the mysterious 1881 photograph of Thomas Hartwell and the ghostly face of Margaret Blackwood. But as guests began arriving for the Friday evening reception, David realized he had made a terrible mistake. The moment the first visitors approached the photograph, the temperature in the gallery began to drop noticeably. Wine glasses frosted over in people's hands, and several guests complained about the sudden chill. David watched in growing horror as Margaret's face in the photograph seemed to become more distinct, more angry, as more people gathered around the display. Eleanor Whitmore from the Salem Historical Society had come to support David's work, but her expression grew troubled as she studied the photograph under the gallery's professional lighting. "David, there's something different about the image tonight. Margaret's expression looks more hostile than it did when you first showed it to me." David knew exactly what Eleanor was observing. Margaret's spirit was feeding off the attention, growing stronger with each person who learned her story. What had begun as a plea for help was rapidly transforming into something far more sinister. Dr. Patricia Hayes, the medical examiner who had processed Margaret's remains, approached David with a concerned expression. "I've been having the strangest dreams since we found that poor girl's body. I keep seeing a woman in Victorian dress standing at the foot of my bed, pointing an accusing finger at me. It's probably just stress from the case, but it feels so real." Before David could respond, the lights in the gallery began to flicker erratically. Several guests looked up at the ceiling with puzzled expressions, and David heard someone mutter about the building's old electrical system. But David knew this wasn't a mechanical problem. As the evening progressed, more disturbing incidents occurred. Wine glasses shattered spontaneously in guests' hands, cutting several people. A journalist from the Boston Globe, who was interviewing David, suddenly stopped mid-sentence, staring over David's shoulder with the expression of terror. "There's a woman standing behind you," the journalist whispered, his face pale. "A young woman in a blue dress. She's staring right at me with the most hateful expression I've ever seen." David turned around, but saw nothing except the gallery's white walls. Yet he could feel Margaret's presence intensely, her anger radiating through the room like heat from a furnace. Other guests were beginning to notice the supernatural activity, and several people quickly made excuses to leave early. Eleanor Whitmore pulled David aside as the gallery continued to empty. "This is what I was afraid of when you first showed me that photograph. You've awakened something that should have remained sleeping. Margaret's spirit isn't just seeking justice anymore, she's seeking revenge." "But we found her body," David protested. "We're giving her a proper burial. Isn't that what she wanted?" "That's what we thought she wanted," Eleanor replied grimly. "But spirits that have been trapped for nearly a century don't always respond rationally to help. Sometimes the anger becomes so much a part of them that they can't let it go, even when justice is served." As if summoned by their conversation, Margaret's voice suddenly filled the gallery, audible to everyone present. "You cannot understand what I endured," the voice said, cold and accusatory. 93 years of darkness, 93 years of scratching at wooden walls, 93 years of calling for help that never came. The remaining gallery guests fled in panic, leaving David and Eleanor alone with Margaret's increasingly hostile presence. The temperature continued to drop until frost formed on the windows, and the photograph itself began to emit an eerie blue light. "Edmund Blackwood sacrificed me to protect his family's reputation," Margaret's voice continued, growing stronger and more filled with rage. "Thomas Hartwell sealed me in a living tomb for money. They both deserve to suffer as I have suffered. But they're dead," David said aloud, feeling foolish for arguing with a ghost but unable to stop himself. "They died decades ago." Margaret's laughter filled the gallery, bitter and terrifying. "Death is not an escape from justice. I have spent these 93 years learning how to reach beyond the veil, how to touch those who wronged me, even in their supposed safety." The gallery's main lights went out completely, leaving only the emergency lighting and the strange blue glow emanating from Margaret's photograph. In that ethereal illumination, David could finally see her clearly. A young woman in a tattered blue Victorian dress, her dark hair disheveled, her face twisted with decades of accumulated hatred. "I can reach them," Margaret said, her translucent form becoming more solid and menacing. "Edmund cowers in his spiritual prison, knowing that I am coming for him. Thomas Hartwell's soul trembles at the sound of my voice calling his name across the divide between life and death." Eleanor grabbed David's arm with surprising strength. "We need to get out of here. Margaret's spirit has become malevolent. She's not the victim we thought we were helping. She's become the very thing that destroyed her in life." But as they moved toward the gallery exit, the door slammed shut with tremendous force. The sound of the lock engaging echoed through the room, trapping them inside with Margaret's increasingly powerful presence. "You will help me complete my revenge," Margaret commanded, her voice now carrying an otherworldly authority that made both David and Eleanor feel compelled to obey. "You will be my instruments of justice, my weapons against those who wronged me." David realized with growing horror that he had become more than just a witness to Margaret's story. He had become a participant in her supernatural vendetta, bound to her by the very act of discovering her remains and sharing her tragic tale with the world. As Margaret's ghostly form approached them across the gallery floor, David understood that helping her find peace would require far more than uncovering the truth about her death. It would require finding a way to break the cycle of anger and revenge that had consumed her spirit for nearly a century. But looking into Margaret's hollow, burning eyes, David wondered if it was already too late for redemption, for her, and for anyone who had become entangled in her quest for supernatural justice. The gallery door remained locked for nearly an hour, while Margaret's spirit raged around David and Eleanor like a supernatural storm. When the locks finally disengaged with an audible click, both of them stumbled out into the October night, gasping for breath they hadn't realized they'd been holding. "My car," Eleanor said, her voice shaking as she fumbled for her keys. "We need to get away from here before she decides to follow us again." They drove in silence through the darkened streets of Cambridge, both lost in thought about what they had witnessed. Margaret's transformation from a pleading victim to a vengeful spirit had been both terrifying and heartbreaking. David found himself wondering if there was any trace left of the innocent young woman who had died so tragically in 1881. Eleanor finally spoke as they crossed the bridge into Boston. "I've seen this before, David. Not exactly this, but similar cases of spirits who become corrupted by their own anger. There was a case in Marblehead in the 1950s and another in Concord 20 years ago. When a soul spends too long focusing on revenge, it can lose everything that made it human. Is there anything we can do to help her?" David asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Maybe," Eleanor replied carefully, "but it would require us to understand exactly what she means when she talks about reaching Edmund and Thomas beyond death. If she's somehow tormenting their spirits, we might be able to break that connection and free all of them." They drove to Eleanor's house in Salem, a small colonial that she had inherited from her grandmother decades earlier. The house was filled with the accumulated research of 3 generations of historians, and Eleanor led David to a study lined with books on New England folklore and supernatural phenomena. "My grandmother was what people politely called an occult researcher," Eleanor explained as she pulled several leather-bound volumes from the shelves. She documented dozens of cases involving restless spirits and supernatural revenge. Some of her notes might help us understand what Margaret is doing. As Eleanor searched through her grandmother's papers, David found himself drawn to a collection of photographs on the mantelpiece. Many showed Eleanor's grandmother with other researchers, documenting supposedly haunted locations throughout New England. But one photograph made David stop in his tracks. The image showed a Victorian mansion that looked remarkably similar to the Blackwood house, with a group of investigators standing in front of it. The photograph was dated 1923, and written on the back in faded ink were the words, "Hartwell House, Final Investigation." "Eleanor," David called, his voice tight with excitement, "look at this photograph. Is this Thomas Hartwell's house in Maine?" Eleanor examined the image carefully, then pulled out a magnifying glass to study the details. "Yes, that's definitely my grandmother's handwriting. And look at this notation in the corner. Subject deceased. Investigation terminated due to dangerous manifestations." She opened one of her grandmother's journals to 1923 and began reading aloud. "March 15, 1923. Received word that Thomas Hartwell of Bar Harbor, Maine, has died under mysterious circumstances. Local authorities report that Hartwell was found in his workshop, apparently having died of fright. Witnesses report supernatural activity in the house for weeks before his death." David felt a chill as the implications became clear. Margaret's spirit was tormenting Thomas Hartwell, even while he was still alive. Eleanor continued reading. March 18, 1923, arrived in Bar Harbor to investigate the Hartwell manifestations. The deceased man's neighbors report hearing a woman's voice calling his name at all hours of the night. Several witnesses describe seeing a young woman in Victorian dress standing outside the house, pointing accusations at the windows. "She was already seeking her revenge," David murmured. "Even before we found her body, she was somehow reaching across the spiritual divide to punish those who wronged her." Eleanor found another entry that made both of them pause. March 20th, 1923. The manifestations at the Hartwell house are unlike anything I have previously encountered. The spirit appears to have the ability to create what I can only describe as spiritual prisons, pocket dimensions where she can torment her victims indefinitely. Thomas Hartwell's soul appears to be trapped in such a construct, experiencing his death repeatedly. The journal entry continued with increasingly disturbing details. Eleanor's grandmother described witnessing Thomas Hartwell's ghostly form being pursued through his own house by Margaret's vengeful spirit, reliving his final moments of terror over and over in an endless loop of supernatural punishment. "If this is accurate," Eleanor said, setting down the journal with trembling hands, "then Margaret has been perfecting her abilities for decades. She's learned how to create these spiritual prisons where she can torture those who wronged her for eternity." David thought about Edmund Blackwood, who had died in 1882, just 5 months after Margaret's disappearance. Edmund died of what they called pneumonia, but Thomas Hartwell Sr.'s journal described him being tormented by Margaret's ghost for weeks before his death. "She probably created the first spiritual prison for Edmund," Eleanor agreed. "And she's been holding both of them captive in these supernatural constructs ever since, perfecting her revenge while waiting for someone to discover her physical remains and give her the power she needed to expand her influence." The realization hit David like a physical blow. "We didn't help her find peace by discovering her body. We gave her the strength she needed to reach into the world of the living and create more victims." Eleanor nodded grimly. "And now she's making it clear that we're next if we don't help her complete her revenge. The question is, what exactly does she want us to do?" As if summoned by their conversation, the temperature in Eleanor's study began to drop rapidly. Frost formed on the windows, and both David and Eleanor could see their breath in the suddenly frigid air. Then Margaret's voice filled the room, clearer and more commanding than ever before. "You understand now," she said, her words carrying the authority of someone who had spent nearly a century perfecting her supernatural abilities. "Edmund and Thomas are mine, trapped in the prisons I have created for them, but their punishment is not complete until the world knows exactly what they did to me." "What more do you want?" David asked, though he dreaded hearing the answer. "I want their names destroyed as thoroughly as they destroyed my life," Margaret replied, her voice filled with cold satisfaction. "I want everyone to know that Edmund Blackwood was a murderer who killed his own daughter to protect his reputation. I want Thomas Hartwell to be remembered as the coward who sealed a pregnant woman in a wall for money." David realized that Margaret's definition of justice extended far beyond the grave. She wanted to destroy the reputations and legacies of men who had been dead for decades, to ensure that their descendants would carry the shame of their ancestors' crimes, and she expected David and Eleanor to help her accomplish this supernatural character assassination. David and Eleanor returned to the Blackwood mansion at midnight on October 31st, Halloween night, carrying with them Eleanor's grandmother's ritual implements and a desperate plan to confront Margaret's spirit directly. The Victorian house loomed against the cloudy sky like a monument to tragedy, its windows dark except for the attic, where a pale blue light flickered behind the glass. "Are you certain this will work?" David asked, as they approached the front door, their flashlight beams cutting through the October darkness. Eleanor hefted the leather satchel containing her grandmother's research notes and ritual tools. "According to these journals, the only way to break a spiritual prison is to confront the spirit creating it and force them to face the consequences of their actions. But it's dangerous. If we fail, Margaret might trap us in one of her constructs along with Edmund and Thomas." They entered the mansion, their footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The house felt different than it had during David's previous visits. The air was thick with supernatural energy, and every shadow seemed to move independently of any light source. Margaret's presence filled every room like an oppressive weight, making it difficult to breathe normally. As they climbed to the attic, David could hear voices coming from behind the walls. Not just Margaret's voice, but the terrified pleading of two men who sounded as if they were being tortured. The sounds confirmed Eleanor's grandmother's theory about the spiritual prisons. Edmund Blackwood and Thomas Hartwell were indeed being held captive by Margaret's vengeful spirit. In the attic, the temperature was far below freezing, and thick frost covered every surface. The blue light they had seen from outside emanated from the area where Margaret's remains had been discovered, though her body was now resting in the medical examiner's facility, awaiting burial. Margaret materialized before them as they reached the top of the stairs, her ghostly form more solid and menacing than David had ever seen her. Her Victorian dress was torn and stained, her dark hair wild with nearly a century of rage, and her eyes burned with an otherworldly fire that spoke of powers beyond human understanding. "You have come to witness the completion of my justice," Margaret said, her voice echoing with supernatural authority. "Tonight, on the anniversary of all the witches who died in Salem, I will expand my domain beyond the spirits of those who wronged me." Eleanor stepped forward, consulting her grandmother's notes by flashlight. "Margaret Blackwood, we understand your pain and the injustice of your death, but you have become something that your living self would not recognize. The innocent girl who died in 1881 would be horrified by what you've become." Margaret's laughter was like breaking glass. "Innocence died with me in that wall. What emerged from 93 years of darkness is something far more powerful than the frightened girl who begged for help." "Show us," David said suddenly, surprising both Eleanor and Margaret. "Show us these spiritual prisons you've created. Let us see what you've done to Edmund and Thomas." Margaret's expression shifted to one of dark pride. She raised her arms, and the air around them shimmered like heat waves. Suddenly, David and Eleanor found themselves standing in what appeared to be Edmund Blackwood's study, but distorted and nightmarish. Edmund's ghost sat at his desk, frantically writing the same letter over and over again, an apology to his daughter that he could never complete. Every time he reached the end, the ink would disappear, and he would begin again, trapped in an endless loop of futile repentance. His face showed the accumulated terror of decades spent in this supernatural prison. The scene shifted, and they were now in Thomas Hartwell's workshop in Maine. The carpenter's spirit was forever sealing and unsealing a wall, building and tearing down the same wooden panel that had imprisoned Margaret. But no matter how many times he destroyed his work, it always reappeared, forcing him to relive his crime for eternity. "Do you see?" Margaret asked as the visions faded and they returned to the attic. "This is true justice. They experience their guilt forever, never able to escape the consequences of their actions." Eleanor consulted her grandmother's notes again, then looked up at Margaret with an expression of sad understanding. "But what about you, Margaret? You've become as trapped as they are, imprisoned by your own anger and desire for revenge. You've spent nearly a century becoming the very thing that destroyed you, a person who puts their own desires above the lives of others." For the first time since her manifestation began, Margaret's confident demeanor wavered. "I am the victim here. I deserve justice for what was done to me." "You deserve justice," David agreed, "but you also deserved peace, happiness, and the chance to move on to whatever comes after death. Instead, you've chosen to become a warden in a prison of your own making." Margaret's form began to flicker, as if their words were somehow weakening her supernatural power. "They murdered me. They sealed me in a wall while I was still alive." "Yes, they did," Eleanor said gently, "and that was a terrible crime that should never have happened. But Margaret, your unborn child died with you in that wall. Do you think that innocent soul would want to see its mother become a creature of vengeance and hatred?" The mention of her child hit Margaret like a physical blow. Her ghostly form doubled over as if in pain, and for a moment, David could see traces of the frightened young woman she had once been. "My baby," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking with genuine sorrow for the first time in decades. "I never got to hold my baby." "Your child is waiting for you," Eleanor continued, her voice filled with compassion. "But not in these spiritual prisons you've created. Your child is in whatever place exists beyond death, waiting for its mother to let go of anger and choose love instead." Margaret looked up at them, and David could see the internal battle raging within her spirit. The vengeful ghost who had terrorized and imprisoned her enemies was fighting against the memory of the woman she had once been, the mother who had died protecting her unborn child. "If I release them," Margaret asked, her voice small and uncertain, "if I let go of my revenge, how do I know justice will be served?" David pulled out his camera and showed her the photographs he had taken throughout their investigation. "The world already knows your story, Margaret. The newspapers are covering your case. The police have officially reopened the investigation, and your name will be remembered as a victim, not a forgotten tragedy. Edmund and Thomas's crimes are being exposed exactly as you wanted." Margaret stared at the photographs, seeing her own face in the 1881 image that had started everything. Slowly, the rage began to fade from her eyes, replaced by a profound exhaustion that spoke of nearly a century spent carrying hatred. "I'm so tired," she whispered. "I've been angry for so long that I forgot what it felt like to be anything else." Eleanor approached Margaret's ghostly form with infinite gentleness. "Then let go, Margaret. Release Edmund and Thomas from their prisons, forgive them for what they did, and go to your child. Choose peace instead of revenge." Margaret closed her eyes, and David could feel the supernatural energy in the attic beginning to shift. The oppressive weight of her anger was lifting, replaced by something lighter and more peaceful. The transformation in the attic was immediate and profound. As Margaret made her choice to release her hold on revenge, the blue light that had emanated from her presence began to change, shifting from cold and menacing to warm and golden. The temperature in the room rose slowly, and the frost on the windows began to melt, creating patterns that looked almost like tears. Margaret opened her eyes, and David saw that they were no longer burning with supernatural fire. Instead, they held the gentle sadness of someone who had finally chosen to let go of a burden they had carried far too long. "I can feel them," she whispered, her voice now carrying the soft tones of the young woman she had once been. "Edmund and Thomas, they're free from the prisons I created. They're asking for my forgiveness." The air around them shimmered again, but this time the vision that appeared was peaceful rather than terrifying. David and Eleanor could see the ghostly forms of Edmund Blackwood and Thomas Hartwell standing in what appeared to be a place of soft, eternal twilight. Both men looked younger than they had at their deaths, their faces no longer twisted by guilt and terror. Edmund stepped forward first, his expression filled with genuine remorse. "Margaret, my daughter, I am so sorry for what I did to you. I let my pride and fear destroy the most precious thing in my life. Can you ever forgive me?" Thomas Hartwell joined him, tears flowing down his translucent cheeks. "I was a coward, Margaret. I should have refused Edmund's request. I should have protected you instead of sealing you in that wall. I've spent 41 years in death regretting my weakness." Margaret looked at the two men who had caused her so much suffering, and David could see the final battle between vengeance and mercy playing out in her expression. Then, with a grace that transcended her years of anger, she smiled. "I forgive you both," she said simply. "Not because what you did was acceptable, but because holding on to hatred has poisoned my spirit for too long. I want to see my child now. I want to go home." The golden light around Margaret grew brighter, and David could see other figures beginning to appear in the ethereal twilight. A woman who could only be Catherine Blackwood, Margaret's mother, stepped forward with arms outstretched to welcome her daughter. Behind her, barely visible but unmistakably present, was the small spirit of Margaret's unborn child. "Mama!" Margaret cried, her voice filled with joy instead of anguish, for the first time in nearly a century. "And my baby, you waited for me." As the reunion unfolded in the space between worlds, David felt tears running down his own cheeks. This was what justice really looked like. Not endless punishment and revenge, but forgiveness, healing, and the restoration of love that had been interrupted by tragedy. Edmund and Thomas began to fade from view, their forms becoming lighter and more translucent as they too were released from the bonds that had held them to the earthly plane. But before they disappeared entirely, both men turned to David and Eleanor with expressions of gratitude. "Thank you," Edmund said, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you for helping her find peace." Thomas nodded in agreement. "Take care of our story. Let people know the truth, but let them also know that forgiveness is possible, even for the darkest crime." Then they were gone, released at last from the supernatural prison that Margaret's anger had created. Only Margaret remained, now glowing with a light that seemed to come from within her very soul. She approached David and Eleanor, her ghostly form more beautiful and peaceful than either of them had ever imagined possible. "Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for caring enough to seek the truth even when it became dangerous. Will you be all right now?" David asked, though he could already see the answer in her radiant expression. "Better than all right," Margaret replied. "I'm going home to be with my family. And David, thank you for developing that photograph. Without it, I might never have found the strength to let go of my anger." She began to fade, her form becoming as translucent as morning mist. but her voice remained clear as she spoke her final words to the living world. Remember me not as the vengeful spirit I became, but as the young woman I was. Remember that love is always stronger than hatred, and that forgiveness can heal even the deepest wounds. With that, Margaret Blackwood's spirit disappeared into the golden light, finally at peace after 93 years of torment. The attic fell silent, except for the normal sounds of an old house settling, and David realized that the oppressive supernatural presence that had dominated the mansion for so long was completely gone. 3 months later, David stood in Greenlawn Cemetery in Salem, watching as Margaret's remains were finally laid to rest in a proper grave beside her mother, Catherine. The headstone, paid for by donations from people who had read Margaret's story in the newspapers, bore a simple inscription: Margaret Blackwood, 1863-1881, beloved daughter and mother, at peace at last. Detective Sullivan had officially closed the case, documenting it as a historical murder, with no possibility of prosecution due to the deaths of all involved parties. But the story had served its purpose. Margaret's tragedy was now part of the public record, ensuring that her death would never be forgotten again. Eleanor Whitmore had helped David publish a book about the investigation, with all proceeds going to support historical preservation efforts throughout New England. The mysterious photograph that had started everything now hung in the Salem Historical Society, accompanied by the full story of Margaret's life and death. Thomas Hartwell Jr. had died peacefully in his sleep 2 weeks after Margaret's spirit found peace, his family reporting that he seemed remarkably calm and happy in his final days. His funeral had been attended by several people who claimed to have felt a presence of forgiveness and peace surrounding the service. As David left the cemetery that day, he reflected on the lessons he had learned from Margaret's story. Justice was important, but mercy was equally powerful. Anger could sustain a person for a time, but only love and forgiveness could provide lasting peace. He thought about the original photograph that had started his investigation, wondering if Margaret had somehow influenced its preservation and eventual sale to him. Perhaps some stories were meant to be told, no matter how long they had to wait for the right person to listen. Walking through the streets of Salem, David felt a profound sense of completion. He had started this journey as a photographer documenting historic architecture, but he had ended it as something more: a guardian of memory, a seeker of truth, and a witness to the power of forgiveness to heal even the deepest wounds. The Blackwood mansion still stood on Gallows Hill Road, but it was no longer a place of supernatural terror. The Salem Historical Society had received an anonymous donation sufficient to restore the Victorian house as a museum, ensuring that Margaret's story would continue to be told to future generations. And sometimes visitors to the mansion reported seeing a brief glimpse of golden light in the attic window, not frightening or menacing, but peaceful and welcoming, as if someone was finally, truly home.